Hi guys, welcome back to the Knitting Expat Podcast channel. I am here today with a tutorial for you guys. So I posted recently on Instagram about me steeking a project, and so many people commented that they were scared of steeking, they'd never tried it before, and so I thought, hey, why don't we do like a little steek along? We'll work on a small project, very low stakes, not a lot of time investment in terms of knitting, so hopefully it'll be less scary cutting. So essentially we're going to make a little mug rug or a swatch. So this could actually be a genuine swatch for a garment or a bigger project that you want to work on that needs to be steeked, or it could just be just for fun. So I'm just popping this in at the beginning because I realized I forgot to mention this. I'm going to be running this little steek along as a sort of like a week-long steek along on Instagram. And so if you want to take part on Instagram, it's just a casual knit along. I might do a couple of prizes just for fun, something small. Then feel free to join in. The hashtag is let's steek together, all one word. Kind of like let's stick together, but let's steek together. You know, I thought that'd be quite funny. And I thought there's no better time to learn a new skill or to conquer a skill that you are afraid of, and I kind of think it's a little bit silly to be afraid of knitting, but hey, then when we're all stuck indoors for the foreseeable future. Yeah, in this day and age right now where we're all having to socially distance ourselves from everyone to try and beat this virus, there's no better time to distract ourselves with our craft. And yeah, anyway, I'll let you guys get back to the video. Now I'm using yarn that is left over from another project that I worked on. So both of these skeins are by Duck Wool. Really, really lovely yarn. I don't know if you can see the label there. But so the grey is called Down Feather, in case you were wondering. And the green is called Merry of Soul. So it's by Duck Wool. She's an American-based dyer. And I picked these up at Indie Untangled in 2019, so October 2019. I've got 4mm needles here. These are Chagus, and I'm going to be magic looping, so you can either cast on enough that you don't have to magic loop, you can do a larger swatch, you can use DPNs, you can use 9-inch circulars, you can use whatever you like to knit in the round, because that's what we're going to be doing. I have just a beginning of the round marker. I have 2 other markers to mark where my steek stitches are. I have some scrap yarn, so this is just some fingering weight leftover scrap yarn that I have. And I forgot to mention the yarns that I'm using are both DK weight. Your scrap yarn, this is what we're going to use to reinforce the steek. It can either be the same weight or thinner than the yarn you use to knit with. I like using a slightly thinner yarn just because it just makes the steek less bulky once it's been cut. I mean, if it was a fingering weight project, I'd still use a fingering weight yarn for the steek reinforcement, but if I'm doing like a DK weight, then using a fingering or sport weight is fine. You'll need a crochet hook in roughly the same size as your knitting needle for the reinforcement. We're doing a crocheted reinforcement. So this is a 3.5mm E hook. I'm using 4mm needles. Doesn't have to be exact, it's close enough. And then just some sharp scissors to cut with. These are just little snips that I have in my notions bag. Not sure where they're from, they were a gift. So yeah, these work, but any sort of sharp scissors will work. You want nice sharp scissors. Before we get started, I wanted to say that I'm not an expert in steeking. I've only steeked a few times before, but I'm not afraid of steeking. So I will also include a link below this video to a bunch of other resources where I learned how to steek. So if you want some other tips, there's some blog posts, there's at least one other video tutorial linked below. So if you want to see some other resources for steeking, then those will also be included. So I'm going to do this swatch in 2 ways. The first way, it's going to be I'm going to do it as one solid swatch, but then I'm just going to have 2 halves to it. The first half is just going to be plain, just in one colour. And the second half is going to be colour work, just because the steek looks like visually when you're knitting looks a little bit different for me, with one colour versus two colours, and the way you sort of show where the steek is different between the two as well. So I thought it would be interesting to show you both options. You obviously don't have to do both options, you can do just one. And yeah, like I said, I'm going to be doing it magic loop. So we'll just get started. I'm going to cast on, I think, 40 stitches, just so that there's a decent number of stitches on the needles. But if there again, you can do as many or as few as you'd like, but remember you are going to be working in the round, so you want it to be, you know, a manageable amount. And yeah, like I said, I'm using 4mm needles with DK weight yarn. You can obviously adjust your needle size according to the weight of yarn you're going to be using. And because this is a swatch, you don't have to be super concerned about getting everything exactly right. This is why we practice. I mean, unless you're actually swatching for a bigger project, in which case pay attention to your swatch. A few stitches over 40, so I've got 40 stitches. I'm just gonna get started in the round. And like I said, I'm doing my magic loop. And actually with magic loop, I don't need a beginning of the round marker because I use the tail as my beginning of the round marker, and I completely forgot that. But yeah, so you don't really need to have a beginning of the round marker if you are working magic loop. But if you are working in the round like completely and not doing magic loop, then yes, you probably will want a beginning of the round marker. So I'm just going to work a few stitches in. Okay, so I've just worked in a few stitches, and then I'm going to pop in my first marker for my steek. So the steek is going to be worked over 5 stitches in this case. So what I do is, if I'm going to be doing just a plain single colour steek, I purl the first stitch and then knit 3 stitches and then purl the 5th stitch, and this way the purl stitches kind of are a visual marker on the knitting, so when you later come back to do your steek reinforcement, you can actually see where your steek is quite clearly, especially if it's a single colour, it's not colour work. It doesn't, it's not super obvious where the steek is. So you see here, I knit up to the steek markers, slip that first marker, purl the first stitch, knit the next 3, and then purl the next stitch, and then slip the marker again, and then you knit back round, and you just keep going, repeating that again and again. I'm going to do about 20 rows ish, 20-25 rows before I switch to doing some colour work. And I will be back to join you when I do that. Okay, so apologies for the lighting change. I've had to turn the overhead lights on just because it's getting a bit dark and gloomy outside. So I've done about 20 rows on this swatch in the round, and as you can see here, you can see where those purl bumps run on either side of my steek stitches. Not sure how well you can see that, but you get the idea. And now what we're going to do is I'm going to move into the colour work portion of this swatch. I haven't got a colour work chart in front of me or anything. I haven't planned anything out. I'm just going to wing it. It's not really important what the colour work is. It's more about how we handle the steek section. So now we're ready to add in our other colour. I tend to hold the contrast colour in my left hand because it makes the colour stand out and is more dominant in the knitting. There's a whole thing about colour dominance that you can look up, colour dominance in colour work, that you can read up about if that is something that interests you. I'm not going to go into that now just because, well, it's not necessary. So I'm going to get up to the steek. Okay, so when you get to the steek section, you're no longer going to do the purl at the beginning and end of those 5 stitches. All of them are going to be in knits. So what I do is I do 1 contrast, 1 main, 1 contrast, 1 main, 1 contrast. So you're just alternating, and you will keep that colour order the same the whole way through. Okay, so you can see here that it's starting to work up. There's no real pattern to the colour work, I'm just doing whatever, but you can see the steeks and how they look. So I'm just going to continue doing this for a little bit longer, and then I'll be back to show you what it looks like at the end and how I bind off. Go back now and done a bit more on that colour work. Not entirely what was going on there at the beginning. I definitely, well, like I said, it wasn't a specific pattern, but then it kind of became one on its own. So that worked out in the end. Yeah, so that's that. Now we're just going to bind off, and the way that I recommend, if you're doing colour work, you can bind off using whatever method you prefer. Like, I really like using Jenny's Surprisingly Stretchy bind off personally, but when you come to bind off your steek stitches, you want to just do a normal regular bind off, not any sort of special bind offs. I mean, you can do, but sometimes you end up with some loose threads when you cut the steek. It's nothing major, it's just something to be aware of. Okay, first things first, cut the contrast off. Okay, so we're just going to bind off the next 5 stitches normally. Then I'm just going to go back to binding off how I was doing it before, and the bind off that I'm using for the rest is the knit 2 together bind off. So when you have 2 stitches on your needle, on your right needle, slip your left needle in through the front and then knit those together through the back loop, and that gives you a slightly stretchier bind off than a regular bind off. Okay, one last little tip. You know when you're working the round and you're binding off and you get to the end and you kind of have this little gap here? What I do is I take the tip of my right needle and I insert it into the first bound off stitch in the bind off. I pick up a stitch from there and then I bind it off, and then that sort of just joins the top. And once you've woven in that end, you won't see any weirdness. You won't see any weirdness at the top. Once that's woven in, there's no gap anymore. Our little swatch is now done. I think I'm gonna have to leave it there for today, just because I think it's almost time. Yep, it's almost time for me to leave to go pick up Layla. So I'm gonna leave that there for now. I will be back to film the rest later. Okay, so I am back again, and if this looks like a different swatch, that's because it is, because I completely messed up the first one when I came to steek it. I have not once in my entire life steeked something and have it go wrong, except the one time I tried to do it for a tutorial. So back to square one, I have re-swatched. I did this one slightly differently, so I'll talk you through what I did. So all I did was I cast on my stitches at the beginning. This is my cast on edge over here, and then I knit a few rows in garter. Then I cast on using a backward loops, cast on 5 stitches for my steek, joined it in the round, and then worked the plain knit no color work section of the swatch, as I told you before, with 1 purl bump column, 3 knit stitches, and another purl bump for my 5 stitch steek. Then I switched to my colour work. I just did a more checkered sort of colour work pattern. And again, for the steek section, I did a green, grey, green, grey, green column in that order. And then I bound off the steek stitches only, using just a regular bind off. And then with the remaining stitches, I knit another few rows in garter and then bound off. This is purely because when I cut my steek open, then my top and bottom edges aren't going to be rolling, which is what happened when I did the first sample, and it just became a little bit more awkward to show you what I was doing. So I just added that garter edge so you can see more clearly what I'm doing when it comes to it, but the actual steeking is going to be the same. So let's do it. So I just did a slip knot, popped it onto my crochet hook, and we're going to attach our yarn to the work, and we're going to work the steek reinforcement by picking up one leg in this grey column, so column 2, and one leg of the stitch from the middle column, so the green column here. So you're going to be picking up one leg grey and one leg green. Okay, I'm starting with the colour work section just because it's clearer with the two different colours what I'm picking up, but the same applies when you get to the plain section below it. So first of all, we're going to attach the yarn into what is the bind off edge in this case. So you're just poking the crochet hook through the bind off, grabbing the yarn, bringing it through, and then through that first stitch. I kind of might do it just a second time to be doubly secure. You don't need to do this, but it doesn't hurt. Also, sometimes you'll see that I put my thumb on the stitch on the crochet hook before I go to pick up stitches with the crochet hook, just because I find it's just keeps that stitch secure and it doesn't run the risk of it slipping off the crochet hook. I'm not a very experienced crocheter, so sometimes I find that that helps in this regard. Okay, so I'm going to pick up the first leg of the grey and a leg of the green, pull the yarn through, and then pull it through that stitch on the crochet hook, and then the next one. Ooh. There we go. Hopefully you can see what I am doing. You just pull it through, and you pull it through that loop that's already on your crochet hook. Probably didn't pick the best yarn for this. This yarn seems to be a bit splitty, so I'm just gonna fix that. Okay, just take your time, don't need to rush, it's not a race. And here we're transitioning into just the solid bit, but you're following the same rule as before. One stitch from one column, sorry, one leg from one column, one leg from the other. In this case, when you're working in the plain section, your purl column here is your guide so that you don't veer off course and you sort of just stay where you are. So on like a bigger cardigan or something, if you've knit it in the round, these purl columns act as your guide when you come to doing your steek reinforcement, so you know where you're working, where you're going, and you're not accidentally gonna like move across your cardigan to the wrong place. Okay, and then when you get to the end, you're just going to secure it into that what is the cast on edge. Just going to do a couple of chains, and then we can trim that, pull that through, and that's your first steek done. Okay, and so now we're going to turn it this way round and work the same but back in the opposite direction. So we do a slip knot, pop that over the crochet hook, tighten it up, not too tight but just enough, and then we're going to secure it. So now we're going to go from, let's just see. Okay, so this is our second column, and then this is the other half of that middle column that we're going to be working into. So we need to go into the cast on edge, secure that in there like I did before. I'm just going to go in a second time just to be doubly sure. There again, not necessary to do that, but I think why not. Okay, so then we're going to go one leg and the other leg, pull through, pull through. Realise I'm holding the yarn in the wrong hand. I am not a crocheter. Sometimes I don't hold it the right way. Into the bind off edge at the top. So now you can see those steek stitches clearly, and you can also see, if you spread it out, you can see that line of ladders down the middle where we're going to be cutting. Okay, hope that's clear. So let's cut. And fingers crossed I didn't mess it up this time. Okay. And there we go. And so the steek will roll under nicely, and then once we've tacked it down and added on our edge, it's going to look really neat. And this has definitely worked compared to last time. It was looking a bit of a mess last time, but this has definitely worked. Okay, perfect. So now I'm just going to show you how I pick up stitches to work the edgings. Okay, so I also wanted to say, sometimes you might get some little fuzzies coming off of your swatch or your knitting when you cut your steek. This is usually a little bit from like the bind off or the cast on edges. Typically not a problem. Okay, so now we're going to pick up stitches for the edging. And in this case, because I did a bit of a garter edge at the beginning and end, I'm going to include that as well as part of my pickup. So, just going to attach our yarn. And then pick up along our edge. Okay, and then now we're here with where the steek is. So in the steek edge, you know, we did the pearl column, you see that there, and then also the green column. We're going to go into the stitch just below that column of stitches just below it. So we're going to be going into the V. Okay, there we go, I think that's better now. So we're going into this column here. So you just insert your needle and pick up a stitch. And you pick up at the rate that your pattern tells you. In this case, I'm going to do 2 out of every 3 stitches. And then skip over one. So now I'm just going to knit a few rows and then bind off. Okay, and that's what it looks like with a finished edge. So it looks nice and neat from the right side, and then from the wrong side it's all sort of folded away and tucks away nicely. So what I'm going to do is actually I'm just going to take the end of this tail from the steek reinforcement. You can use any yarn for this at this point. You can attach fresh yarn, you can use the yarn used for the edging, you can use your main colour yarn, whatever you want to tack down this steek. So I'm just going to show you how I do that. All I'm going to do is I'm just going to pick up a stitch from the back here. There we go. And I'm going to go into this corner piece part of the steek reinforcement bit of fabric, and then I'm just going to do a little light whip stitch along, picking up a bit from the main fabric and going through the steek reinforcement to hold it down. Of course you will want to do this in ideally the same colour yarn as the main fabric, but if you do it carefully you won't see it through the right side of the work. But this step is optional, you don't have to do this. The steek reinforcement will kind of just sit there on its own, folded back. I just like it to keep it in place, keep it neat. Some people will like to take a, a ribbon and cover the steek reinforcement section with a ribbon altogether. I've never quite done that just because I haven't been bothered enough, but I find this is usually enough to secure it. And then just weave it back in through the steek reinforcement, being careful not to push it through to the right side. And then that end is done. And then that reinforcement is tacked down as well. I mean, at this point you could still go back and pop a ribbon over it if you really wanted to, but you know, like I said, if you pick up your stitches carefully on the wrong side when you're doing the whip stitch, you're not going to see it on the right side, even if you did do it in a contrast colour like I did. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly do the other side and then I'll be back to show you what it all looks like. Okay, so we are done. My plans to have a garter edge at the top and bottom to stop this curling has somewhat failed because it's still curling quite a bit. And apologies about the rubbish lighting situation, but we are now done. We have 2 edges. Oh my goodness. There we go. We've got 2 edges, and if I turn it around you can see I have tacked down the steeks. I have sewn in all of my ends just so you can have a clearer picture of what's going on back here. Okay, and sometimes I get some loose thready bits at the tops and bottoms. I just tack them down when I'm tacking down the steek reinforcement, and this is not going anywhere. You get the idea. The whole point of this was just to gain some confidence to cut your knitting. Anyway, I hope you found this tutorial helpful, and now I'm just going to reset the camera setup and answer a couple of questions that I got. So like I said, lighting is a bit funny right now because we've got the late afternoon sun, but I got a couple of questions when I posted about doing this video on Instagram, and I wanted to answer those quickly for you guys. Okay, one person said, do you have to use non-superwash wool for steeking? Ideally, that is like the preferred type of yarn to use when you're going to be steeking, because non-superwash wool is more like sticky, I guess is probably the word to use. It's more grippy, so it grips onto the other yarn around it, so it's less likely to unravel, and just over time it will like ever so lightly felt together, so it stays put, like it's not going to move. But every yarn I used in this, the grey, the green, and even the steek reinforcement, is superwash. So it can be done with superwash yarns, and for the purposes of swatching today or this week when you do your steek swatch, for the purposes of like this practice, I wouldn't worry about making sure you had non-superwash yarn. Use what you have on hand, but if you're going to be swatching or working on a larger project, a garment, something else that you're going to be steeking, then ideally, yes, you would have non-superwash yarn because it would be better, but I personally don't think it's the be-all and end-all if you had a superwash yarn to steek with. If you're going to use a superwash yarn to steek with, the most secure way of steeking and doing your steek reinforcement is a sewn reinforcement, which with using your sewing machine if you have one, or by hand. But it can be done with a crochet reinforcement as well. Like I said, there's all these different methods for doing things. You know, there's no knitting police, there's no one to say, I'm not a purist when it comes to my knitting. You know, if I want to steek with a superwash yarn, I will steek with a superwash yarn, and I will just take precautions to make sure I tack it down properly at the back, and I'll take precautions to make sure I secure the beginning and end of my steek very well to make sure nothing unravels. So that's my advice when it comes to that. Like I said, that's just my opinion. I know there are some die-hard purists out there who are like, no, you have to use non-superwash yarn if you want to steek. But that's my thoughts on that. Okay, so had a couple of questions from someone else, and she's asked, if I want to knit a sweater in the round, and then later I want to turn it into a cardigan by steeking it, my question is, should I add extra stitches for steeking? And if so, how many? And if no extra stitches are needed, how can I make a straight line up and down the sweater to prepare for steeking? Okay, so if you've already knit a sweater in the round and you then decide you want to steek it to make it into a cardigan, the best thing that you can do is thread some scrap yarn onto your tapestry needle and figure out where the center of your cardigan is going to be, the center of your sweater where you want to cut your steek. And then with your scrap yarn, just do a long running stitch down that central column with your tapestry needle, and then you will have a line of yarn running through your cardigan, and that will mark your central line. So in the case of when we did our steek, that will mark column 3, that middle column, and then you can use that as your marker to then, when you go to pick up stitches for your steek reinforcement, to make sure that you don't veer off course, and that is your central line. The other option is if you're going to be doing it at the beginning, so you're going to knit a sweater, but you know you want to turn it into a cardigan at the offset. When it comes to the part to join in the round, whether that's at the very beginning, or if you do, especially if it's top down, or sometimes with top down jumpers or sweaters, you do some work flat and then you join it in the round for the rest of the sweater. I would personally add 5 extra stitches, like we did the 5 stitches for the steek in our swatch. I think 5 is a good number. You can potentially do it with as few as 3, but 5 just gives you a bit more wiggle room. You don't really need more than that. And then yeah, you just work it the same way. You just follow the pattern as written, and then you add your 5 stitches. And assuming it's not colour work and it's all in one colour, then I would recommend you do the 1 purl column at either end of your steek stitches, so then that's your marker. If it is colour work, then you would work that section as I showed you before, like just alternating colours over those 5 stitches, so then that acts as like your line of where you're going to be steeking. So I hope that answered your questions on that one. If you have any more questions about steeking or you're unsure about it, just let me know in the comments below this video on YouTube, and I will be sure to try and answer them for you. And if I don't know the answers, I will try and point you to the right resources. Like I said, there are some other tutorials linked below this video as well. There's a couple of really good blog posts with photo tutorials, like step by step what to do, and there's also another video tutorial by Very Pink Knits, who is an amazing teacher on YouTube for knitting related content. So I always highly recommend her channel whenever someone asks me about online video resources for learning knitting skills. I always send people to her because that's how I learned to knit. Her channel is like hands down how I learned to knit. So yeah, that's where I would send you. Okay, so I hope you found this video useful. I hope it's not too long, and yeah, so thank you for joining me, and I will see you guys again soon.